Well, Justina, it is so great to have you here on the Formidable podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I was hoping we could just start out by hearing a little bit about how you got started in impact investing. What attracted you to that?
Yeah, well, I think it was my career path is not exactly a straight line, but I did start my career pretty traditionally in investment banking before moving over to the buy side doing growth equity and leverage buyout transactions across the US and Europe. And I would say that I really loved what I was doing from a skill set perspective, from a mindset perspective, from the discipline and the rigor, but I didn't feel as though it was very aligned with my personal values and goals. I had the great fortune of I'm a child of immigrants, and I had the great fortune of going back to my ancestral village in China with my grandma, my aunts, my dad, my whole family, and it was just a really stark moment for me. It was a defining moment in my life in that I was in this village where I still have second, third cousins that live there with no running water, no electricity, and we visited our ancestral home, which was just a two room home where my older aunts, so my two older aunts, were born on a concrete slab. And that was, as I mentioned, a defining moment for me of really wanting to feel as though whatever I do in this world, I want to put more back into it than I take from it. This idea of being more regenerative rather than extractive. But at the same time, I loved investing. So I felt as though there had to be some way in which I could take an investment skill set and mindset and, for lack of a better term, do some good in the world and really align with that regenerative mindset. And so I went back to business school, and between my first and second year of business school during the summer, I found my way to investing in old agricultural enterprises in Rwanda. And that was, as you can imagine, an aha light bulb moment for me of my goodness, I am taking private equity principles. I am, applying them to a totally different challenge and, of course, in a totally different context. But ultimately, I'm taking private equity principles. I was sitting there building Excel models around dairy chillers. And so I was hooked. This is all I wanted to do. At the time, it was not obvious it was a good career choice. Honestly, my parents thought it was crazy to go to business school to to end up doing something where you would make significantly less money. But I was really fortunate in that, serendipitously, just as I was graduating from business school, the Rockefeller Foundation had just convened this group of practitioners in the space that had been doing this work and had coined the term impact investing and started to create this community of practice. And that's really what launched my career in impact investing, and that was over 15 years ago, and I have not looked back ever since.
I love that. What an amazing story. So, how old were you when you went to your ancestral village?
I was in my mid 20s.
Okay. Oh, I can see how that would be just what an experience. That must have been emotional.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had been younger, I might not have had the ability to reflect or the reflection and introspection to really understand what it meant for me in my life. And so I think it was actually really great for me in that moment in time in my life.
Incredible. So I'm hoping you can start us off maybe by defining impact investing. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's got a very simple definition with a lot more nuance behind it. But effectively, impact investments are investments that are made with the intention, and intention is an important word here, but with the intention to generate positive, proactive social and environmental impact alongside that of a financial return. Um, Again, a very simple definition, but a lot of nuance to what that actually means in practice and a lot of different approaches, a whole spectrum of approaches to actually achieving that.
No, I appreciate that clarity off the top. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of those differences, some of the trends that you're seeing, and some places where you're seeing the most interest within that definition right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nuances really are around a couple of things. So intention is one of them. I do think that you cannot have impact without intention. I think social and environmental impact itself can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I mentioned there's sort of a spectrum of approaches to the ways in which you create impact. For some people, it's more around business practices and processes. And so they're really looking more at the environmental, social, and governance characteristics of an investment. For others, impact really means more thematically oriented solutions where the products and services you're investing in are actually solving fundamental social and environmental challenges. And then for others, they're really thinking more at a systems level. So yes, the capital itself matters, but more importantly is what role you play within the system. So, this is sometimes the argument that folks make for divestment, where if there's sufficient capital deciding to divest from a certain area, then the theory is that that could result in enough of a change in the cost of capital for a business to change incentives, and to change business practices. So there's, again, a lot of different sort of approaches you can take in terms of, again, business practices and processes versus products and services, but also different approaches you can take based on different levels of the system that you're operating at.
That's interesting, the way that you kind of define those, because I do want to dive in a lot deeper on some of those things. But I was just reading something, literally moments before we hopped on here, about carbon renewal companies and how much they're struggling right now to get the funding that they need. And I know that's a very expensive thing to invest in. I think there's a Seattle company that just shut down because of lack of funding. And you were saying, lack of funding can sometimes change business practices. I would imagine that impact investing is also aimed at preventing things like that from going away. Is that accurate?
I think that's right. I mean, of course, a component of what impact investing is I mean, divestment is actually quite a small portion of the overarching industry, I would say, and a small part of the opportunity set. And I would say we're actually not big advocates of wholesale divestment because oftentimes there isn't sufficient capital behind a certain divestment campaign and to result in enough of a reduction in the cost, increase in the cost of capital to a business to actually incentivize them change. We actually think that there's a lot more value in engagement, and successful engagement strategies can really shift business practices. And if you think about these companies, they are really large, multi-billion dollar multinational companies, and so even incremental change is quite scalable in that sense. But 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 really, to your question, the majority of the impact investing space is really oriented around solutions. And carbon reduction can be a component of that, but there's sort of the concept of um, climate change mitigation as well as adaptation, as well as in the absence of mitigation, carbon removal. And I think like a lot of other innovations, there's sort of a maturation curve that happens. A lot of newer innovative technologies like carbon capture or carbon removal and storage are quite newer in their evolution and their maturation. And by definition, they require the riskiest form of capital that's available to them to really prove out the technology. And to your point, um, when technologies are emergent, they're incredibly expensive because they're not scaled. I mean, this is true. This is sort of Moore's law of technology and technological adoption. So there is some component of this where these technologies just need to uh, work their way through this innovation and maturation process, and they will eventually get to sort of more of a growth stage where the technology is proven, and it's really more about commercialization, and then eventually to real scale where all they're looking for is ongoing growth capital. Um, and so I think some of this is just a natural growing pains that you see in any kind of technology and industry. Um, but you're right that this kind of capital is really critical, but capital is really critical throughout that whole maturation process for all kinds of different technologies. We still need capital to continue to scale proven technologies like utility scale renewable energy in the form of solar and wind. We still need a lot of capital for transitions of the energy system and in electric vehicles. So a lot of proven technologies still need capital. I mean, I think the the key takeaway here is that it's all hands on deck. We need it all.
That's a great takeaway. Within your role right now, do you all have certain verticals that you focus in on? Are there different stages that you look for companies? And how are you thinking about what L&W is doing around impact investing?
Yeah, we don't have any specific areas that we focus on more than others. I would say that, we have the great privilege of building custom portfolios for our clients. And because we do that, we really are looking across geographies, across sectors, across industries, across impact themes. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is support our clients in building custom portfolios that address their very targeted and specific impact goals, while recognizing that impact considerations really are one consideration amongst many that we're utilizing to take, construct a diversified portfolio for our clients. So we're taking a total portfolio approach where we really want to deeply understand our clients' theory of change, their very specific impact objectives, and where within their portfolio it's possible we want to have that direct targeted impact. But in other parts of their portfolio, it might be more financially prudent to take a broader based approach towards creating impact, because we recognize our clients have other goals for their investment portfolios, whether it be, spending needs, risk return, liquidity, legacy, philanthropy, and we want to ensure that we're constructing a portfolio that meets all of those objectives, including their impact objectives.
Are you seeing more and more firms kind of take that similar approach where impact investing is always part of a portfolio discussion? Like that's something that investors are looking for?
I think we've seen a lot of increase in interest over time. I mean, we've seen it ourselves in our own client base, and in the growth of our impact investing practice. But equally, we've proactively chosen to invest in it because we believe it adds value to client portfolios, and is something that clients really value. Um, it's hard for me to say. I mean, I'm friendly with many of our peers and competitors in the space, and I really admire the work they do and appreciate the work they do. We feel as though what we do is perhaps a little bit more different, and is more holistic and integrated throughout everything that we do.
I love that integrated approach, though. I think that's really interesting. Um, so, when does impact investing make the biggest impact? That sounds kind of cliche, but what advice do you have for investors who are seeking to do good while doing well? Um, you know, how should individuals be thinking about investing when it comes to their own portfolios?
Yeah, I think it has, where impact investing has the biggest impact is really when you're able to think about it holistically throughout your life. I mean, I think the way we approach it with clients is to recognize that our clients manifest in the world in a lot of different ways. We are, of course, primarily responsible for supporting them with their investment portfolios. However, our clients are also philanthropists with grant capital at their disposal. They are also members of the community with community and social capital available to them. They're also voters. They're also employees, which is a different kind of role and a different form of capital they bring to the table. They may be, volunteers or board members. And so there's a lot of different ways in which our clients manifest in the world. And really, we want to understand what our clients are trying to achieve holistically in their lives. We want to understand them as whole human beings, and what goals they might have, and what impact they want to have on the world. And we support our clients through this, for lack of a better term, a theory of change exercise, which is really a logic model of saying, okay, if this is the ultimate impact that you want to have in the world in the long term, how do we work backwards from there to understand what are sort of the medium term outcomes we were looking for? What are the short term output metrics that we would measure to tell us whether or not we're on the right path? And, based on that, what are the right activities or inputs to bring to the table? What are the initiatives that are really going to solve this problem? And what is the right form of capital to finance that initiative? And, how should you think about allocating your scarce resources, whether it be grant capital, investment capital, social capital, to really address this theory of change and achieve the ultimate impact that you want to have. So we really think about it as somewhat of a resource allocation exercise, but also as a holistic alignment exercise. And we think that that's where you can have the most powerful impact is by leveraging all forms of capital that you bring to the table in service of the impact that you're seeking in the long term.
Okay, great. That's super helpful. And then you've got kind of on the other spectrum, the big, huge companies like BlackRock and Bain Capital, and they've made these sort of pronouncements about impact investing and made that kind of a key part of their focus. How does that affect just the general public's perception of impact investing and sort of your day to day life?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, you know, what I was talking about before in terms of maturation of a technology. I think equally you can apply that maturation model to that of an industry. And I think what you saw was this massive mainstreaming of impact investing that happened. I think overall that's a really positive thing because you do, you know, it is somewhat of a recognition of the financial materiality of these considerations and these trends. Um, you know, I think that mainstreaming oftentimes leads to overexuberance or could lead to disingenuous, inauthentic efforts that lead to what's been termed greenwashing in the industry, where folks are it's sort of like false advertising, or it's certainly virtue signaling, or it's more performative than it is real. You know, this is unfortunately not an uncommon thing in any sort of trend that gains traction. And so I think what we're seeing is more of a natural pullback from that. It's a natural result of those growing pains where two things are happening. One is that there's greater rigor around that greenwashing. So you see regulators getting involved to ensure that you know, investors and consumers are actually getting what they're being told they're getting. So it's somewhat of that truth in advertising aspect of it and holding people accountable for doing what they say they're doing. I think that's you know, regulation is a positive thing to create more standards and again, to sort of lend greater credibility to the industry. I think you're also seeing a lot more discipline from investors who are saying, okay, well, initially I got really excited about this. I invested in this particular strategy or fund because of the way it was marketed or the way it was named, but now I'm realizing that I wasn't actually getting what I was paying for. And I think that kind of additional rigor and discipline is also really important, and accountability is really important in the space.
What do you watch out for when you're reviewing opportunities to just make sure that your folks are not being taken advantage of in the greenwashing concept or anything else that's maybe disingenuous or not achievable or you know something like that? I mean, I guess every investment has its risks, of course, but how do you evaluate those?
Yeah, I think it's really a core part of our due diligence process. So we've been doing this for a very long time. So we feel as though we have the right kind of experience and expertise in order to better discern the authenticity and credibility of the work. But, you know, first and foremost, we're looking at intention, as I mentioned. We're really looking for those opportunities where an impact strategy drives a fundamental investment thesis and therefore drives investment decision making. So we're not looking for strategies where impact is a byproduct or an overlay. It needs to be deeply integrated into the investment thesis and investment strategy itself. So that's what we're looking for up front. And then, you know, in our due diligence process, we're really trying to understand, you know, what the team's ability is to execute upon this, which is, you know, partly, you know, based on their past experience and track record, you know, their performance to date. We're looking at what kind of reporting they provide, not because you know, we really think about reporting as not a one-way flow of information, but really as important information for us to hold our managers accountable for achieving the impact that they're setting forth to achieve, and to ensure that there's no drift from the original strategy and thesis that they set forth. So we really use that reporting to ask better questions of our managers, and again to ensure that there's real accountability built in. We're looking for incentives. You know, how are they incentivized in terms of achieving impact? So those are all elements of what we're looking at. The last piece I will mention, though, which might be a little bit different for us, is we're looking for organizational holistic alignment up and down the value chain. So we're not looking only at where the dollars are being placed, but also, who is making those investment decisions? What kind of company and what are their business practices? And is that reflective of their investment strategy? If they're telling us in selling their product that they believe that incorporating environmental social governance considerations into their investment process will result in better investment outcomes, then they need to believe that to be true of themselves. They need to be applying those same principles to their own business practices.
So a lack of that would be kind of a red flag for you.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I
Um,
could give you an example, which I don't know whether if you might need to cut this part out because I'm not quite sure if, well, you can listen to it. I just want to tell you because it might be really interesting to you, but I don't know if we can actually include in the podcast. But, I get pitched a ton of opportunities, as you can imagine. And this is such an egregious example. It's astonishing. But, a firm came in and pitched me their gender equity strategy. They had a real thesis behind it. There's a lot of both academic and practitioner evidence that shows that greater gender diversity at, the board level and the management team level leads to better returns on asset, return on equity, return on investment. Totally fair. I believe that. But when I turn the tables on them and ask them, what does your team look like? What does your board look like? They had fewer than a third of women on their board and on their investment team. So the team that was executing the strategy was not gender diverse. And then, this is the kicker, they had just settled a gender pay equity lawsuit. So that's how you can tell, right? I mean, again, they had a credible investment thesis, but they did not apply it to themselves. And so,
wow. Just wow.
yeah. Anyway, I'm not sure we can. Well, maybe it's fine. I don't know.
Yeah, you didn't give any names, so
That's
I think
true.
you're safe. Wow, that's striking though. I think that's such a helpful example. Um,
It's a
it's
very egregious one, but
indeed an egregious one, but helpful to understand. Well, let's kind of dive into that a little bit more actually, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the criticism of uh, ESG in general, but there's been a lot of pushback lately about impact investing and the ROI not being what was initially promised. So when you look at that, when you see those headlines, Justina, where does your head go?
yeah, I think some of it is legitimate criticism. I think actually primarily around the impact performance versus financial performance. I think there's a lot of academic and practitioner evidence out there that shows that impact investments have performed in line, if not better, over the long term. There's, of course, going to be some level of variability on a year to year basis, and there is some dispersion in terms of strategies, although that argues for having more skill in selection. Um, but I also feel as though that's no different than traditional investing, and so impact investing should absolutely be held to a higher standard from an impact perspective and delivering the impact. But I struggle a little bit with the higher standard of impact. 100% of impact funds needing to outperform all traditional strategies, right? I mean, I think by definition you're going to have some level of dispersion, and that's okay. I mean, that's why you need skill in selection, and over time the lower performing, the poorer performing strategies will shake out. So I do think, as I mentioned, I think there is some legitimate criticism around greenwashing. I think there's some legitimate criticism around not achieving the impact objectives or goals that were set forth. I think that those are reasonable, and I said part of the maturation of the industry that's happening. But other criticisms I think are really misplaced and really conflate ESG and impact investing with fossil fuel divestment, which is a very specific thing. I also think a lot of this has unfortunately become highly politicized, and I don't believe this should be a political issue. And so my sort of approach to this is to largely to tune out the noise and the politicization. To me, actions matter a lot more than words. I think, we can absolutely sort of reframe what's going on. I mean, a lot of investment is already going into the transition. There's these these are globally relevant issues for global companies. I mean, this is sort of not we're not going back. And despite the criticism in the U.S., I mean, this is something that both Europe and Asia are are sorry, what am I trying to say? Can you cut that part out? um, both Europe and Asia are really, there's a lot of momentum within those markets. And ultimately, to me, this needs to be the ordinary course of business. These are table stakes issues, um, because these are financially material issues. And so I think there's a real missed opportunity here if you allow yourself to. I think it's okay to not be vocal and performative about this. I mean, I think much more important to just do the work because I think first you're missing significant risks, particularly from climate as well as from a social justice and a racial reckoning. Um, and you're missing really attractive opportunities to invest in innovation, which will provide you with competitive advantage. Um, I think it's pretty safe to just tune out the noise and focus on what really matters and what really matters to your business.
I love that take. I was thinking about something. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, that the EU has all of these rules forcing companies to be thinking about ESG and forcing them to, report out their findings. Meanwhile, in the United States, they're getting pushback on those very things, and so it's this sort of yin and yang, and it's really hard for a lot of these global companies to comply. Do you see a parallel to that? Is impact investing taking off more in the EU and Asia as a result of what you were just talking about, or is it just quieter here?
I think there's interest across the board, and I think it's primarily because there's this recognition that there's real financial immateriality here. There's real risks posed by these issues, and there's real opportunity, really attractive investment opportunities that people ought to be taking advantage of. So I don't know if I think you'll hear more about it in the EU. I think you'll find a lot more sort of supportive regulation and policy in a lot of ways. But I think the private sector continues to lead in the U.S. and we have the largest sort of climate policy in the world, which has led. So I think what you've heard is a lot of folks in the EU talking more about sticks, and a lot of folks in the U.S. talking more about carrots. Where some of the regulation that you're seeing in the EU feels more focused around compliance. I think that information that we're getting is really important. Disclosure is really important. It's important for investors to make better decisions. But I think, for companies, unsurprisingly, it's a lot easier for them they prefer the approach that involves carrots. But as I said at the very beginning of this, I think it's kind of all hands on deck. We need all of the above.
So interesting. So for those seeking to get their companies to do more impact investing, or trying to influence people or organizations that are in a position to do more of this, do you have any talking points for them? Do you have any ways that they can sort of show up and make that argument?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of getting started. Start asking the questions. I mean, I think, at times it can feel really overwhelming. I think people can often feel paralyzed by just the amount of information they feel like they need to know, or the education they need to have in order to pose these questions. But I don't think that to be true. I think you're a stakeholder as I mentioned before, you manifest in the world in a lot of different ways, and you're a stakeholder in a lot of different ways for example, as an employee. And I think as an employee, you have every right to ask your company, as an employee stakeholder, you have every right to ask a company key questions around, um, how is this company positioned for the future? How is this company addressing fundamental climate risks, whether it be related to, operations, so is it operational risk or transition related risks? How are you thinking about workers as a stakeholder? How are you ensuring that you're investing for the employee of the future? And what's critical to us? How are you incorporating considerations of all stakeholders, because that is your license to operate, and that is, again, your long-term source of innovation and competitive advantage. And so, there's a lot more you can do, but I feel as though, um, you know, starting with a lot of questions is it will already prompt the company to sort of think differently.
Would you apply that same kind of advice to board directors, for example, who are a lot of our listeners, sit on corporate boards or large nonprofit boards? What would you suggest for them as they look at a company's risk profile, as they look at their investments and how they think about the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even more critical for boards since it's their fiduciary responsibility to really understand the kinds of risks that are posed. I mean, climate change, as one example, really presents systemic risks and opportunities that are increasingly relevant to asset pricing and really can't be ignored by any company or investor. And so, I think thinking systemically about those kinds of risks, whether climate, employee engagement, all of these are financially material to businesses, and again, should be on a board's radar.
Absolutely. Look at my questions here, see if I missed anything. Oh, I did read this really interesting report. I'm sure you read all of these things all the time, but the Stanford Social Innovation Review said that impact investing is supposed to be hard. And I just thought that was such an interesting takeaway, that it sort of stands at odds with traditional financial markets and incentives. Do you kind of agree with that philosophy? And what's your take on that?
I haven't read that specific article, but if it's what the headline says, I fully agree. I mean, and I love that. It's actually what I really love about my job is it's incredibly multifaceted. It's incredibly dynamic. It requires deep thought. It requires not just sort of financial analysis, but real introspection as well. I do think it's a multi-dimensional model. It's not sort of just risk and return. This third, fourth, fifth dimension that you constantly need to be thinking about. And so I agree. I think anything worthwhile doing is going to be hard, and I think there's no question in my mind that impact investing is worthwhile. Both because again, you're exposed to a lot of risks if you're not paying attention to this, but also because, there are real attractive investment opportunities, um, and you're positioning yourself for the future.
Absolutely. Well, that leads me very nicely into this question, which is, let's think way ahead in the future for the kind of work that you do. What does this look like 20 years from now? What kinds of conversations you're talking about, sort of the maturity of this concept of impact investing? Where do you see it going?
Yeah, I mean, it may sound cliche to say it, but I hope that all investing is impact investing. I mean, my not so secret goal is to get us to 100% impact. And I think going back to your prior question around, impact investing is meant to be hard. It is meant to be hard because I also hope that in the process of pursuing these goals, we are able to actually shift systems and shift incentives. As you mentioned in your prior question, traditional investments and financial systems have a certain set of incentives, and impact investing has a very different set of incentives. And my hope for the planet and for people on the planet, is that impact investing leads to a shift in those incentives and systems, so that impact investing is all investing.
I love that concept. All right. Well, I'm gonna ask you a tougher question here, Justina. Like part of your job is to convince people who've been doing something the same way for a long time to do it a little bit differently. How do you approach that? What's your sort of leadership style, and how do you get people to kind of come along with a concept that they might be resistant to?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think really I approach it really as meeting people where they are, and then sort of pushing them along over time. And I think, most investors are truly intellectually curious people. I think they get into investing because they're intellectually curious people. And so I really try to tap into that, the intellectual curiosity of wouldn't you like to understand why someone thinks differently than you? Wouldn't you like to hear about why I think this might be a better or more interesting approach to take in your investments? Wouldn't you like to understand how this could really challenge you in different ways after you've been doing something the same way for many years? Um, and I feel as though most people are willing to engage in that conversation. And I found that you know, look, I think it's incredibly healthy to have skepticism. I mean, every investor should be skeptical. That's what makes you a good investor. But also, equally, investors um, can, with the right data, the right information, and the right thesis, can sort of overcome that skepticism and pursue this kind of an approach.
That's great. Well, I want you to kind of leave us with, maybe some forward-looking thoughts about impact investing and how you see it. How are we saving the world here? And what are some opportunities? Maybe if you have any examples of any time that investment really did have a surprising and very satisfying impact, some stories or anything like that that you could share.
Wait, I'm sorry. Your first part of your question, I it was totally on the tip of my tongue.
Just talking a little bit about pushing it forward, thinking about impact investing, where you've seen it have impact, where you've seen things really kind of take off as a result of an investment.
Right. Sorry. Actually, sorry. The first part of your question was really around, like, save the world. So let me answer that first. So first, I want to just acknowledge that impact investing is not a silver bullet or a panacea. It's one tool in the toolbox. It's sort of one part of the overarching ecosystem, and I really do think, again, all those different forms of capital and all the different players in the ecosystem need to come together to really, you know, to really solve the social and environmental challenges that we're facing. Um, in terms of you know impacts that I've seen or been really excited about, I think that there's a whole range. Again, there's sort of like the really small subscale things that can eventually be proven and can eventually scale, and then there's the really big, scalable, large investments that really are dollars to work now on the ground. But I think I might give an example of an earlier stage opportunity, just because it's one that's near and dear to my heart. In that we got pretty creative about the way in which we approached it. It was a very small investment, and it was actually for only one client. So really different from most of what we do. But one of the things that we do is support our clients in uh, investing in ways that we are catalytic. And so these catalytic investments are ones that don't typically adhere to our traditional sort of risk return liquidity requirements, but rather are ones that are explicitly targeted towards specific social and environmental impacts that our clients want to have without um, it, with financial returns really being a secondary consideration. But those kinds of catalytic investments can really be a wonderful complement to the other impact investments in our client's portfolio. So we have this client who's really focused on affordable housing in Baltimore. And there are some investments in this client's portfolio which are risk-adjusted market rate investments in affordable housing. But one of the areas that we really wanted to, um, you know, pioneer and support in the hopes of scaling is this concept of community land trusts, where the land is really held in a community-based trust to maintain permanent affordability of homes. And so rather than sort of just lending capital to this community land trust, we instead decided to fund an escrow account at a bank that would back an acquisition and construction line of credit at that bank. And initially, the leverage was 1-to-1. So the exact number of dollars we put in that escrow account was the amount that this bank was willing to lend, again, in this line of credit. With this line of credit, they began, acquiring homes, rehabbing them, and then selling them, and, paying down the line of credit with the sale of each home, again, at, 30 to 50% area median income levels, permanent affordability. Over time, that bank became more and more comfortable because they saw the track record, they saw the sort of repayment, and so they felt more comfortable increasing the leverage 2-to-1. So we didn't have to increase our dollars and our clients' dollars in that escrow account, but we were able to unlock additional capital for the community land trust. And then over time, they increased it 4-to-1. And so that was sort of the overarching thesis. And eventually, actually, this bank was a small local bank, and the community land trust was able to secure an even larger line of credit from a much larger commercial bank, traditional national that you would have heard of, without the requirement of an escrow account backing from us. So it's sort of incredibly small scale, incredibly niche, but the theory of change was that you could support this organization in developing a track record, providing a demonstration effect that then would unlock significantly more capital, and then would then no longer require the need for an escrow account. So that sort of additional leverage that you get out of it was really powerful.
What an incredible example. I love that. Yeah, that's gotta leave you feeling good at the end of the day.
Yeah, it really does. And it's not to say that this organization doesn't continue to face challenges as a small nonprofit. And, there's still a lot more work to be done. I think there's always going to be, unfortunately, a massive need for affordable housing in Baltimore. But again, it felt what I like about that example is sort of the creativity around how we structured it to really meet the need.
Well, this has been so informative, Justina. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wish that I had?
Oh goodness, that's a tough one. No, I think for me, I think I just want to be as helpful as possible to your listeners, and I would really just encourage your listeners to think about all the different ways in which they manifest in the world, and all the different ways in which they can have impact, use their voice in whatever role they're playing in whatever context and situation to really, have the change that they seek.
I love that. Well, what a great way to end. Justina, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a fascinating conversation, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.